Thank you so much for joining us.
You for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
So, to start things off, we want to kind of look back historically at the origin of the role of sheriff. And in particular, I'm wondering if you can talk through the historical role of sheriffs during the Jim Crow era.
Yes. So sheriffs enforced the rules that maintained the Jim Crow era's racial hierarchy throughout the South. They hold a lot of power in areas where they're the only law enforcement official, and they really exercise that power to maintain those racial hierarchies uh, for the benefit of white communities. They facilitated lynchings. Elected sheriffs and their deputies were members of the Ku Klux Klan. In one of LDF's early cases in 1949, three young Black men and one 16-year-old boy were actually falsely accused of raping a white woman in Groveland, Florida, in Lake County. And Gilbert King wrote a book detailing the case and the experiences of the young men in Devil in the Grove, which won a Pulitzer Prize. And the story really illustrates the role that sheriffs and their deputies played to enforce the racial hierarchy during the Jim Crow era. For example, Sheriff McCall, who was the Lake County sheriff, led a mob of hundreds of white men to track down one of the people who had been falsely accused, Ernest Thomas. And they chased him for 10 days until they found him sleeping under a tree, exhausted, where they shot him 400 times, over 400 times. And hours after the accusation, the false accusation of rape, mobs of white residents burned and razed the homes and property of Black families in Groveland. And the Black community in Groveland fled, fearing for their lives. And none of the perpetrators of violence against Groveland's Black community were arrested. The sheriff and his deputies stood by while the violence raged against Black homes and people. And the sheriff claimed he couldn't identify a single person that had perpetrated the violence, even though he'd been present. It was a small community where everyone knew everyone. And he also attended KKK meetings and warned people not to cooperate with the FBI. And the three defendants who were still alive, remained to be tried, were tortured by the sheriff's deputies, and two falsely confessed under pain of torture. And the remaining three defendants were convicted by an all-white jury, while evidence that proved that the crime never occurred was never disclosed to the defense. And Thurgood Marshall took the cases of the two defendants who'd been sentenced to death to the Supreme Court, where the convictions were overturned. But before the new trial could take place, the sheriff shot the two defendants who had been sentenced to death already, Sam Shepard and Walter Irving, who were about to be retried at point blank range while transferring them to the courthouse for trial, and then tried to cover it up. Sam Shepard died. And Walter Irving miraculously survived, even after being shot again by one of the sheriff's deputies who arrived on the scene and noticed that Irving was still breathing. And Mr. Irving was then convicted again by an all-white jury and again sentenced to death, but received a stay of his execution after a lot of advocacy from LDF attorneys and the NAACP, though he also mysteriously died in Lake County when he returned after serving his sentence to attend an uncle's funeral, while McCall was still sheriff and still in office in 1969. And as the case was proceeding, the regional head of the NAACP, who was critical about the sheriff's handling of the case, was murdered along with his wife by a bomb under their bedroom floor that exploded while their family slept. That murder was never investigated. The perpetrators were never identified, even though in an investigation in 2012, it was found that the KKK had a map of the Moore family's home. And so this experience of the Groveland boys and the Black community in Groveland really encapsulates the ways in which local sheriffs were integral to enforcing Jim Crow justice. White perpetrators of violence were never identified or held to account, and Black people who were deemed to not know their place were subjected to violence against their families, their homes, and they were killed, either extrajudicially, including by law enforcement, or through the criminal legal system with the approval of judges and courts.
Thank you so much, Puneet. I think walking through that particularly devastating story illustrates so many of the ways, both historically and today, sheriffs have operated with impunity. And I think while Sheriff McCall's actions are particularly heinous, I think in many ways he is not unique, especially at that time, in terms of facilitating lynch mobs against Black people who had been detained in a jail, and the ways in which sheriffs across this time period and in the South were really maintaining and reinforcing the racial hierarchy. I also want to bring us to the modern day and the role of sheriffs today, which in many ways looks quite similar. Can you talk us through the kind of expansive range of responsibilities that a modern sheriff has today?
Sheriff can vary, and it basically depends on where the sheriffs are located and what other law enforcement authority is in that region. So there are times where they are the main or only law enforcement authority in a jurisdiction, and that tends to be the case more in rural counties where there are no police departments, and there's a less dense population and not enough population to maintain a separate local police department. And so sheriffs will often have jurisdiction over one or more counties. And they are the only and the main law enforcement authority, and they would do everything that a police department does. They would respond to 911 calls for service. If someone, needs help with something, then it would be the local sheriff that responds, and they would conduct all the investigations that a normal police department would do into, domestic violence, any other priority crimes that occur. They would do all the investigations. In areas where there are police departments, however, the sheriffs often have a sort of a secondary law enforcement authority. And so what their role and responsibility is would then be outlined in agreements with the police department, in contracts with county governments and city governments. And of course, their conduct is still regulated and would be regulated by local and state laws as well.
Can you also touch on some of the responsibilities of a sheriff that extend beyond traditional law enforcement, like thinking about their role in operating jails, and in some counties, how sheriffs have even additional roles, like maybe executing eviction warrants, potentially being the coroner in that county? I think some of these roles, I think people might think of sheriffs as strictly being law enforcement officials. So if you could talk through some of their roles outside of law enforcement.
Yeah, so sheriffs generally maintain the local jails, and that's the case whether there is a police department or not. So even when there is a police department, the sheriff would be the one that would maintain the jail, process folks in the jail, be responsible for the maintenance of the jail system and facilities. So whatever the issues are for people who are incarcerated in the jail, those would be under the sheriff's jurisdiction and responsibility. And jails are where, people who have been arrested are held until their criminal proceedings have been concluded, or sometimes where they serve their sentence too. And managing jails can be an additional opportunity for abuse because of the conditions that people are held under and the bases for which they're being detained. For example, recently, in current modern history, in 2016, the U.S. Department of Justice actually investigated the Evangeline Parish Sheriff's Office and the Ville Platte Police Department because they exhibited a pattern or practice of arresting people and holding them in jail, even where they had not committed any crime, because they wanted to get information or coerce, cooperation in investigations. And it was just a regular part of their procedure. They just arrested people and held them in jail until they provided the information that the sheriffs and the police wanted. So jails are one of the ways that sheriffs differ from local police. And another difference is their power to create posses. So this is a unique and historic aspect of sheriff's departments where they actually recruit members of the public to serve law enforcement functions. And this is authorized, through historic common law, sometimes state law as well. And what sheriff's posses do depends on the sheriff's office or the rules of the state, but they often are authorized to do, a lot of law enforcement functions that a deputized officer would do. They, assist with traffic stops. They, would assist with the service of warrants, and sheriffs can authorize members of posses to carry guns in states like Arizona and Michigan. So in some ways, sheriffs are more powerful than police departments because they run the local jails and have the power to summon and use volunteers like posses. But their actual law enforcement function may also be more limited than police, depending on what other agencies are in the jurisdiction, what role they play.
Thank you. And you mentioned the role that the DOJ can play in holding sheriffs accountable. I think sheriffs kind of present themselves as being accountable to no one except the voter. But I think it's important to remember that there are multiple structures that are designed to hold them accountable, the federal government being one of them. Can you share a bit about your experience on the DOJ's team litigating against Sheriff Joseph Arpaio of Maricopa County, Arizona, and what that kind of lawsuit looked like and what the goals were of that strategy?
Yeah, so the Federal Department of Justice and in some states, the state attorney generals now have powers to conduct pattern or practice investigations. And these are essentially investigations into law enforcement agencies where there's evidence that there's systematic unlawful conduct by the agency. And so an investigation into Sheriff Joe Arpaio was launched in 2009 by the U.S. Department of Justice. And the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, where he led for a pattern and practice of unlawful conduct. And that investigation found that the sheriff and his agency, the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, had engaged in systemic unlawful conduct in a few ways, through racially discriminatory policing practices in traffic stops and arrests of Latinx people, through unlawful retaliation against people exercising their First Amendment rights, to criticize MCSO's practices, and often the criticism was about the racially discriminatory policing practices of the office, and also discriminatory jail practices against Latinx inmates with limited English proficiency by punishing them and denying them critical services. So DOJ uses this pattern practice authority to both investigate systemic unlawful conduct, but also to craft agreements that are meant to address the underlying issues that lead to that unlawful conduct, and ideally to prevent it in the future. And in almost all cases, law enforcement agencies that are subject of the investigation want to fix the problems and enter into settlement agreements to address what DOJ believes are the causes of the systemic unlawful conduct. Sheriff Arpaio did not do that. He resisted cooperating with the investigation and forced DOJ to sue for access for documents. And he also forced DOJ to litigate their findings from 2011 until 2015, when the parties did finally reach an agreement. I think the only other law enforcement agency to resist DOJ findings and not settle into an agreement was also another sheriff's office in North Carolina of Alamance County. So Sheriff Arpaio was sued, many times for systemic unlawful conduct by the DOJ, and also, other organizations like the ACLU. But even after a court order in an ACLU lawsuit, finding that the sheriff had committed a pattern of unconstitutional conduct. And after the DOJ's investigation and findings, Sheriff Arpaio kept getting reelected. He held office for 24 years, from 1993 until 2017, and finally losing in an election in 2016. And he was eventually found to be in contempt of court for violating court orders in 2017, a criminal charge. But only 2 months later, he was pardoned by then President Donald Trump.
So I think this example is one that's like somewhat unique and maybe like exceptional, especially given the pardon by the president. But in general, there is a trend of sheriffs acting with impunity and still holding office despite findings of unlawful conduct. Can you talk through what structures in the design of the position of sheriff allow sheriffs to often act with impunity, maybe relative to like a local police chief?
The aspect of sheriffs, the fact that they are elected, sometimes lends them to focus more on politics than their goal of being reelected than on what ideals for public safety for the community might be, and that is a challenge. Part of the challenge, though, is also the same challenge that exists for all law enforcement agencies, which is that there are limited mechanisms for oversight. And while, the federal government has authority to investigate systemic unlawful conduct, and some states have granted that authority to attorney generals, by and large, there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the US, over 18,000. There are more than 3,000 sheriffs in the US, and there are only so many resources for investigation and oversight. And because of the power that sheriffs wield over their communities where they enforce laws, people who are subjected to abuse often don't have the mechanisms to hold either individual deputies responsible or the sheriffs responsible if the broader community continues to reelect them. So I think where the abuse is targeted towards minorities in a community and where the broader community supports the politics of the sheriff, it can be, absent some oversight mechanism from a state attorney general or the federal government, it can be a real challenge to really exercise oversight over sheriffs.
And you mentioned the role that sheriffs play in terms of politicking and their politics at the local county level and their relationship to their voters. And we're also seeing in the last few years sheriffs playing an increasing and outsized role at the national political level. Can you talk about the constitutional sheriffs movement, including what the movement is and its relationship to white supremacy?
So the so-called constitutional sheriffs movement is a movement of sheriffs that wrongly believe that they have more power in their jurisdictions than federal officials, including the president. So this is disturbing because historically, when states in the South have resisted recognizing the rights of Black people or other minorities, it's required federal intervention to protect those communities, including Black communities, from harm and to ensure that communities are able to exercise their rights, and to force states and local governments to comply with their obligations to all residents, including racial minorities. And school integration is one example. So after Brown v. Board, many jurisdictions refused to integrate their schools, and federal mandates were required from courts and agencies in Congress to enforce integration and desegregation. So beyond that concern of the historic role of federal government in enforcing the rights of minorities, particularly in the South. There are board members of groups that have lead the movement of so-called constitutional sheriffs that have been members of white supremacist organizations. One example is Michael Perutka, who is a board member of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, who was a member of the League of the South, and Richard Mack, who's the founder of the CSPOA, is a former board member of the Oath Keepers, an anti-governmental group whose members were involved in the January 6th insurrection and attempts to stop the peaceful transfer of power. And one major feature that animates a lot of anti-governmental groups like the Oath Keepers is an anti-immigrant sentiment. The founder of the Oath Keepers, Stuart Rhodes, repeatedly made racist anti-immigrant statements in informal documents. So I think groups, like the Oath Keepers will now profess to be anti-racist and use examples of Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks to illustrate what they say are their goals, but while denigrating the rights of racial minorities.
Thank you. And you mentioned this link between the constitutional sheriffs movement, the Oath Keepers, and the January 6th insurrection. And I want to hone in on this issue of election integrity. We have a big election coming up this year. Are there potential threats and risks that the constitutional sheriff movement poses to election integrity in this year's election season? And in particular, do these risks pose a threat to Black political power?
So there is a risk that these sheriffs and their deputies could intimidate people who belong to groups that sheriffs may view to be a threat, such as racial minorities or perceived immigrants. And, there have been proposals to increase surveillance of ballot boxes to prevent voter fraud, which is, such a small scale. But the surveillance itself could prevent people who don't want to encounter law enforcement because of the negative experience that they and their communities have had from coming to polls. These groups also promote misinformation. The CSPOA had previously formed another group that promoted the false claim that the 2020 election was stolen. There are some sheriffs that are proposing ideas like anonymous tip lines for alleged voter fraud, even though anonymous tips are infamously unreliable and generally not credible. And there are some sheriffs that are members of the CSPOA who have been suspected of engaging in election interference. I think the risk is real. I also want to be careful because it's important for folks to feel that they can safely exercise their power to vote. And while the number of sheriffs who've been suspected of actual election interference is small, but the risk and threat of the consequences of that is serious. So I think the risk does need to be taken seriously, but also in perspective that overall, the numbers of sheriffs that are likely to directly interfere with people's voting ability is small. But it is, because it's serious, it does need to be taken seriously.
Thanks. I think that's really helpful context to remind us all to be aware of the threat and the risk without letting that kind of silence us or kind of build fear about exercising our right to vote ahead of the election. In our last couple minutes, I want to shift us to talking about potential strategies and solutions to address these kind of wide-ranging, unchecked powers of sheriffs, and in particular, strategies to rein in their power and divest from these systems of law enforcement that, in many ways, reinforce white supremacy.
Yeah. So for extremist groups like the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters and the Proud Boys and members of the Constitutional Sheriffs Movement, states really need to prohibit these groups from influencing law enforcement officers and agencies throughout their state. And they can do that by prohibiting these organizations and their members from providing trainings for any state licensing or accreditation classes for either individual officers or agencies. And federal agencies can incentivize that too by tying their federal grant funding and requiring that states and agencies that get funding agree to such prohibitions and comply with them. And beyond that, for what people can do in their own right, local elections are really important. And people who are, voting should pay attention to candidates for sheriff. And unfortunately, sheriffs often run unopposed, but especially when they've been in power for a long time, it's really important that their authority and their position not go unchallenged. So paying close attention to sheriff's races and voting in them and running for, encouraging candidates that are aligned with local communities' views and public safety is really important. But ultimately, the problems with sheriffs are also parallel to the problems of law enforcement writ large, in that our system of law enforcement is often ineffective and harmful and doesn't actually achieve safety, particularly for Black and Brown communities and other historically marginalized groups. And we need to actually create systems that prevent and address the root causes of violence and conflict, that improve the social determinants of health so that communities can be safe and healthy on their own, such as through investments in things like education equity and housing and built environments, healthcare access, and economic stability. And our framework at LDF for public safety proposes alternate responders for 911 calls that are unarmed, and mechanisms like restorative justice to address disputes rather than incarceration, which is just a punitive system, and investments in the services and the resources that create the long-term stability and community health and safety that would reduce 911 calls to begin with and prevent crises from happening in the first place.
Thank you so much. I think that offers our listeners both some immediate term, more proximate interventions of how to be really engaged and holding your own local sheriff accountable, and then also larger structural ways to address law enforcement generally and shrink our reliance on law enforcement to achieve safety. Thank you so much. This really covered everything I was hoping to cover. Is there anything we didn't touch on that you want to add, Puneet?
I don't think so.
Amazing. Thank you so much.